Europe is facing one of its most dangerous moments in recent history. China has just imposed sanctions on 2 European banks. At first glance, it may seem like a minor incident, but in reality, it's a clear warning. Beijing is signaling that it has the power to hit much larger institutions if it chooses to. And ironically, it all started with Europe itself. The EU was the first to impose sanctions on Chinese banks for their cooperation with Russia. At the same time, pressure from Washington is growing. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is urging the EU to take a harder stance against BRICS countries. But he's not doing this for Europe's benefit. It's about protecting the dominance of the US dollar. For Europe, however, this pressure comes at a high cost, as trade with BRICS nations amounts to hundreds of billions of euros. Italy serves as a perfect example of just how deep this economic dependence runs. Consider Pirelli, the well-known tire company, which has major investment from a Chinese state-owned firm. This partnership was supposed to open doors to the Chinese auto market. But during Donald Trump's presidency, the US blocked Pirelli tires from being used in Formula One races in America, citing national security concerns. And now, Trump is preparing a much more severe blow, this time targeting the global chip industry. Such a move could spike prices, shatter supply chains, and drag Europe into economic turmoil alongside the United States. That's why it's important to break down how all of this has unfolded. Let's start with Trump's warning, a statement that sent shockwaves through capitals around the world. Just a few weeks ago, Trump publicly warned BRICS countries that if they attempted to create an alternative to the dollar, the US would retaliate with tariffs. Not just targeted ones, but across the board, at least 10% on all goods, without exception. The message was crystal clear. The dollar must remain the core of global trade, or America will impose heavy costs on those who challenge it. And this is where Europe stepped in. Instead of focusing on its own interests, Brussels quickly aligned with Washington. In early August, the EU announced its 18th sanctions package since the war in Ukraine began. Hidden in that package were sanctions against 2 small Chinese banks, Swifenhe Rural Commercial Bank and Haihei Rural Commercial Bank. These banks mostly deal with regional trade, local financing, and some cryptocurrency transactions. The EU justified its decision by claiming these banks were helping Russia evade sanctions. As of August 9th, European companies were banned from doing business with them. But here's the irony. These 2 Chinese banks don't even operate in Europe. They have no clients there, no transactions, and no presence in the European financial system. In other words, the EU achieved nothing tangible by sanctioning them. But it still managed to provoke Beijing. This came despite clear and repeated warnings from China. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi had directly told EU diplomats, "If you impose sanctions on our banks, there will be consequences." That warning was ignored, and the response came swiftly. On August 13th, China announced its own sanctions, this time targeting 2 Lithuanian banks, UAB Urbankas and AB Monobankas. These aren't major institutions either, but the choice was symbolic. China has had ongoing tensions with Lithuania since 2021, when Vilnius allowed Taiwan to open a representative office under the name Taiwanese, a red line for Beijing. In response, China downgraded diplomatic ties, expelled Lithuanian diplomats, and blocked Lithuanian exports. So, when the EU targeted Chinese banks, Beijing knew exactly how to strike back, not just with any banks, but with ones based in Lithuania. The message was clear. Size doesn't matter. Symbolism does. China was saying loud and clear that any escalation would be met with a response. And now, all of Europe has received the message. Because if we look at the broader picture, it's clear that Europe is far more vulnerable in this confrontation than China. In 2024, trade between the EU and China reached nearly 800 billion euros. China is a vital market for European cars, luxury goods, and industrial equipment. German car makers like Volkswagen and BMW sell more vehicles in China than in Germany. French luxury brands like LVMH rely heavily on Chinese buyers for champagne, fashion, and designer goods. Italy exports machinery and equipment, while Spain sends agricultural products. This dependence works both ways. Europe imports critical goods from China, including solar panels, electric vehicle batteries, rare earth elements, and pharmaceuticals. Without these imports, Europe's green energy transition and shift to electric vehicles would grind to a halt. So why risk all this over sanctions on two small rural banks that don't even operate in the EU? The answer lies with Washington. Brussels continues to follow Trump's lead, even though his policies directly hurt European interests. In fact, just weeks ago, Trump threatened to impose tariffs on European cars and steel, accusing the EU of taking advantage of the US in trade. Still, Europe stays in step with Washington, aligning itself with US priorities, even when it means pressuring China to please Trump. The consequences? Europe is left with fewer and fewer options. The sanctions target not just China or Russia, but the entire BRICS alliance, a group that now includes over 20 countries, such as Brazil, India, and South Africa. These are precisely the markets Europe needs as alternative trading partners. Meanwhile, Russia, the reason behind all these sanctions, hasn't collapsed. Moscow has built parallel financial systems, sells oil and gas to India and China in local currencies, and is even piloting the digital yuan. The sanctions against two obscure border banks have done nothing to stop this. In the end, the move was purely symbolic. Brussels wanted to show unity with Washington and appear tough on Russia. But in doing so, it provoked China, a key economic partner, and gained nothing in return. To fully grasp what's happening, we need to understand the bigger picture. Washington is fighting to maintain its control over the global financial system. Europe, caught in the middle, risks paying the price, economically and strategically. The US dollar is still the world's main reserve currency, but that dominance is increasingly under threat. BRICS countries are actively developing alternatives, and that's what has enraged Donald Trump. His tariff threats aren't just about trade. They're about defending the dollar's central role in the global economy. But ironically, each aggressive move from Washington only pushes BRICS nations closer together. This alliance is growing, welcoming new members, and investing heavily in payment systems that bypass the dollar entirely. At the latest BRICS summit, cross-border settlement and trade in national currencies were top priorities, and momentum is clearly building. Instead of halting this trend, Trump's pressure campaign is speeding it up. And now, Europe finds itself at the center of this global storm. Rather than seeking balance or protecting its own economic interests, Brussels has tied itself to Washington's agenda. That decision is leaving the EU vulnerable, not just to retaliation from China, but also to the broader shift in global trade and finance away from dollar dependence. Europe could have played the role of a bridge between competing powers. Instead, it's aligning itself with a partner whose global influence is weakening, while much of the world is already learning how to operate without the dollar. Italy provides a striking example of how US pressure is influencing Europe's decisions. On the surface, it looks like Rome is scaling back economic ties with China, but the reality is more about fear of Washington's reaction than sound economic reasoning. Chinese investment has been a crucial support for several Italian industries, creating jobs, transferring technology, and providing access to one of the world's biggest consumer markets. Rather than strengthening this cooperation, Italy is being nudged to undo it. Take Pirelli, one of Italy's most iconic companies. A Chinese state-owned firm, CNRC, owns a 37% stake in it. One might assume this would help Pirelli tap deeper into the Chinese auto market and grow. But instead, the US stepped in and blocked Pirelli tires from being used in Formula One races in America, once again citing national security. Yes, even tires are being labeled a security threat. It may sound ridiculous, but it perfectly illustrates the current reality. Washington is effectively deciding which European companies are allowed to thrive and which must be restrained. And Europe is now suffering the consequences of its own choices. German exports to China have sharply declined since 2022, especially in automobiles and precision machinery. On top of that, cutting off Russian energy has forced European industries to rely on more expensive energy sources. Today, Manufacturers in the EU pay 2 to 3 times more for energy than competitors in Asia. This massive cost gap is undermining Europe's competitiveness, pushing factories to scale back production, relocate operations abroad, and lay off workers. And just as all this is happening, Washington is preparing a move that could shake not just Europe, but the entire global economy. A new escalation in the semiconductor tariff war. The most alarming development comes from inside the US. According to leaks from the administration, Trump is planning to introduce tariffs of up to 300% on foreign-made microchips. The goal is clear: to pressure companies like TSMC, Samsung, and Japanese suppliers like Tokyo Electron to shift key parts of their supply chains to the United States. But the fallout could be huge. If these companies comply, the cost of producing chips in the US will skyrocket. Labor, energy, and infrastructure are all far more expensive in the US than in East Asia. Those increased costs will ripple through the entire economy, affecting smartphones, laptops, electric vehicles, and even military equipment. If the companies resist, American consumers will feel the pain. Prices for chips will go up, and that means higher costs for nearly every modern product. At the same time, supply chains for rare earth elements, already under stress, will come under even more pressure. This isn't careful industrial policy. It's an attempt to take control of the global semiconductor industry through brute force. But it's a dangerous gamble. Can the US really strong-arm Asian tech giants without triggering serious retaliation? Retaliation that could hurt America's own tech sector. And this won't just be a US problem. If Trump follows through, the very trade system that sustains both the US and Europe could start to unravel. For Europe, already squeezed between China's countermeasures and US demands, it could mean being dragged into a conflict it cannot control. So the big question now is, will Europe finally start defending its own interests? Or will it continue sacrificing them to serve Washington's agenda?